Now, from CBS 4 News, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Good morning. I'm Lauren Pastrana. Welcome to Facing South Florida. Jim DeFede is off this week. Election Day is 2 days away, but some people may not even know it. Off-year elections tend to have low turnout, but the results usually have the biggest impact on local communities. Some of the big municipal contests this cycle include mayoral and commission races in Miami, Hialeah, and Miami Beach, the election to replace late Congressman Alcee Hastings in Florida's 20th congressional district, and several ballot issues, including an earlier last call for alcohol in Miami Beach. FIU professor Catherine DePaulo Gould focuses on state and local politics, and she told me the relative few people who actually do vote will have a huge say in how local government works for the rest of us.
Historically, obviously, people turn out in mass numbers for presidential elections. Those are the big names. All the attention goes to those big races, but it's really these small races in the municipalities or countywide even that really are the ones that affect how we live day in and day out. How important are these elections that are just around the corner?
These local races are really the kinds of races where they affect your daily life, from, turning on the electricity in some cases, to driving on the roads, to whether your garbage gets picked up. And I think people don't realize how important some of these local races are because they're not as high profile. And so people think things are going along just fine. Sometimes there are shocks to the system, and there'll be some more interesting election for a particular race or some issue in particular that really motivates people to go to the polls. But in these off-year elections, people aren't necessarily expecting an election. It's not the presidential cycle where everybody's paying attention. It's not a midterm election where we have a governor's race, sometimes a Senate race or other races to motivate people. So the local races really kind of get left behind.
Because these elections don't get as much attention, unless maybe people are watching, hopefully, their local news and they're getting that information. How are they getting informed about these candidates and these issues? Where should they be turning to get this information? Because hopefully, yes, they do show up to vote, but maybe they don't recognize the names or know what these ballot measures means. What should they be doing before getting into that voting booth?
Well, the local news, I think, is really, really important. Whether you're talking about on TV or you're talking about the local newspapers, because that's where you get the best coverage. You're covering the stories, you're covering them in depth, and the candidates and the issues. But if people aren't paying close attention to some of those, all they really see are perhaps signs in somebody's yard, or, they see a sign, vote today, and many just won't bother, right? So, but those that are really coming out to vote in these off-year elections, we do find are very informed consumers. I mean, they are paying attention to the local news. So even though that turnout is very low, they are informed on the issues, on the candidates. Barring that, these nonpartisan races, you don't have an R or a D, which can serve as a voting queue. So a lot of times, it goes by name. You've seen that name, or, that person's name, sounds like me and my community. And so that might be a reason to vote for somebody. But, usually these people are pretty well informed, and that's the flip side of having lower turnout.
I think we have a very recent example of how who we elect and who are put into local offices can impact beyond what people might think. Just looking at the city of Miami and the issues they've had with the commission and the termination of the police chief, who was hired by the city manager with the approval of the mayor, but it came down to the commission to say, nope, you're out of here. How important is it that people understand that those roles that they may consider small actually have a lot of power within the city or the county that they serve?
Oh, absolutely. I think people have a sense that, the media always sort of talk about the federal government. It's of course not unimportant. We talk about what the governor does. That's important. But on day-to-day life, I don't think people realize that what your city commission, what your county commission, even your local school boards, what they are doing on a daily basis are impacting you, from the minute you wake up until you wake up the next day, right? I mean, these are really important issues. And I think until there's some kind of major news item, there's a scandal, people aren't necessarily paying attention to what is going on. They're happy and they're content. Trust in local government is much higher than we find in trust in the federal government or even at the state government level. And that's been pretty consistent. So I think people think as long as things are humming along nicely, right, I don't necessarily need to be involved. Will this matter, right? But those who are showing up know it matters. And, there's lots of local elections even across the country that are decided by just a few votes. And so, I think the large amount of people who do show up are really allied with one candidate or another, or, with one electoral coalition, one group or another. And that group can be varied interests. But those are the people who see the absolute stake and who has political power. So, until sort of the average person, right, who may not have an interest in politics particularly, may not, see any particular difference in candidates, when they do, that's when they will turn out to vote. And I think, the messages are clear out there of how important this is, and again, I think there's plenty of information that voters can find. I think off-year elections, though, as I've stated, kind of throw people for a loop. If they go to the ballot and they're voting for president or they're voting for governor, they may be surprised by what is on the ballot, but you're going to have higher turnout. Those who in off-year elections will be paying attention, are the ones who tend to vote. And I think, anything with Miami tends to be more nationalized, and Miami specifically, there's been news out of Miami Beach, these things that are also permeating, I think, the other news that is also out there. So, I think it's some of these smaller municipalities that may not, get the same kind of attention, that people are seeking from all kinds of different other avenues besides local news.
Remember, early voting ends today and Election Day is Tuesday. The polls are open from 7 to 7, so get out and vote. Up next, she's a doctor who gave birth in the pandemic and also lost a loved one to COVID. Now she's using her platform to spread awareness. We talk to Dr. Jennifer Schell when we come back.